What's up everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating yet often overlooked periods in Westeros history, the era of Dunk and Egg. While many fans know these stories as charming adventures of a hedge knight and his royal squire, few realize that these tales take place during arguably the weakest period of the entire Targaryen dynasty. We're talking about a time when the house that conquered Westeros with fire and blood was hanging on by a thread, facing existential threats from within and without, all while their greatest weapon, the dragons, had been extinct for nearly a century. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying this deep dive into Westerosi history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. Trust me, you won't want to miss our upcoming videos on the Blackfyre Rebellions and the tragedy at Summerhall. Now, let's get into why the Targaryens were at their most vulnerable during the time of Duncan the Tall and Aegon the Unlikely. So first, we need to set the stage here. The Dunk and Egg stories take place roughly 90 years before the events of Game of Thrones, starting in the year 209 AC with the Hedge Knight. This is a period that bridges the golden age of Targaryen power and their eventual decline into madness and extinction. To understand why this era represents the nadir of Targaryen strength, we need to look at what came before and what came after. The Targaryen dynasty began with Aegon the Conqueror, who united 6 of the 7 kingdoms under his rule using 3 dragons and an iron will. For nearly 150 years after the conquest, the Targaryens maintained their grip on power through a combination of dragon dominance, strategic marriages, and when necessary, brutal displays of force. But everything changed during the Dance of the Dragons, that catastrophic civil war that tore the realm apart roughly 100 years before Dunk and Egg's adventures. The Dance of the Dragons was absolutely devastating for House Targaryen. This wasn't just a political squabble, this was brother against sister, dragon against dragon, with the entire realm choosing sides. When the smoke cleared, most of the Targaryen dragons were dead, and the survivors were shadows of their former glory. The once mighty beasts that could level castles and incinerate armies were reduced to stunted creatures, their growth limited by confinement in the dragon pit. Within a few decades of the dance, the last dragon died, no bigger than a cat. The Targaryens had lost their ultimate trump card, the very thing that had made them gods among men. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Without dragons, the Targaryens had to rely on traditional means of maintaining power, political alliances, military strength, and the loyalty of the great houses. And this is exactly where things started to fall apart during the Dunk and Egg era. The rot actually began with King Aegon IV, known to history as Aegon the Unworthy, and boy did he earn that nickname. Aegon the Unworthy was basically the worst king Westeros had seen up to that point. His reign from 172 to 184 AC was marked by corruption, favoritism, and spectacular misrule. He fathered countless bastards, alienated his true-born son Daeron, and generally made a mess of everything he touched. But his final act was the one that would haunt the Targaryens for generations. On his deathbed in 184 AC, Aegon legitimized all of his bastards, every single one of them. This wasn't just a generous act of a dying father, this was a loaded gun pointed at the heart of the dynasty. Among these newly legitimized bastards was Daemon, who would take the name Blackfyre after the Valyrian steel sword Aegon IV had given him. Daemon was everything a king should be, at least on the surface. He was a warrior, charismatic, looked like the perfect Targaryen with silver hair and purple eyes, and he had been publicly favored by Aegon IV over the true-born heir. Meanwhile, the actual heir, Daeron II, was scholarly, bookish, and worst of all, in the eyes of many nobles, he was heavily influenced by his Dornish wife and her retainers. This sets up the first Blackfyre Rebellion, which erupted in 196 AC, just 13 years before the event of the Hedge Knight. This rebellion was absolutely massive. It literally divided the realm in half. While most of the great houses remained nominally loyal to the Targaryens, countless lesser houses and even some branches of the great houses threw their support behind Daemon Blackfyre. The rebellion culminated in the Battle of Redgrass Field, one of the bloodiest battles in Westerosi history. 10,000 men died that day. 10,000. Demon Blackfyre fell on that field, killed by a rain of arrows that would become known as the Bloodraven's Rain, named after Brynden Rivers, one of Aegon IV's other bastard sons who fought for the Loyalists. But here's the thing, even though the Loyalists won, the victory came at a tremendous cost. Prince Baelor Breakspear, the heir to the throne and one of the most capable warriors and leaders in the realm, was accidentally killed during the trial by combat that takes place in the Hedge Night. His death wasn't directly part of the rebellion, but it was a consequence of the instability it created. Now, when we meet Dunk and Egg at the tournament at Ashford Meadow in 209 AC, the realm is still reeling from the first Blackfyre Rebellion. The wounds are fresh, the realm is divided, and everyone knows that the surviving Blackfyre supporters have fled to the Free Cities, where they're already plotting their return. This isn't just ancient history. This is an ongoing existential threat to Targaryen rule. But wait, there's more. As if the Blackfyre threat wasn't enough, disaster strikes in the form of the Great Spring Sickness. This plague hits Westeros like a hammer in 209 and 210 AC, right at the beginning of Dunk and Egg's adventures. We're talking about a disease that killed tens of thousands of people across the Seven Kingdoms. Major cities like King's Landing, Old Town, and Lannisport were devastated. In King's Landing alone, 4 out of every 10 people were affected by the disease. And here's the kicker, the Great Spring Sickness didn't discriminate between highborn and lowborn. King Daeron himself died from the plague, along with his 2 immediate heirs, Princes Valar and Matarys. Think about that for a second. The king and his 2 eldest heirs all wiped out by disease in a matter of months. The succession crisis this created was absolutely catastrophic for Targaryen stability. The new king, Aerys I, was completely unprepared for the throne. He was more interested in books and prophecies than actually ruling, leaving the real power in the hands of his hand, Brynden Rivers, also known as Bloodraven. Now, Bloodraven was effective, ruthless even, but he was also deeply unpopular. He was a bastard, he had 1,000 eyes and one, as they said, meaning he ran an extensive network of spies, and he wasn't afraid to use draconian measures to maintain control. His rule during Aerys reign was basically a police state. To combat the Great Spring Sickness, Bloodraven ordered bodies piled 10 feet high in the dragon pit and burned with wildfire. When that wasn't enough, he had corpses burned where they lay, which resulted in a quarter of King's Landing burning to the ground. These were necessary measures perhaps, but they didn't exactly endear him to the common people or the nobility. The Targaryens were maintaining power through fear and brutal efficiency, not through love or the awe inspired by dragons. So now we're in the 210s AC, the era when most of Dunk and Egg's adventures take place. Let's take stock of the situation. The dragons are gone, extinct for over a century. The first Blackfyre Rebellion has just been put down, but at enormous cost, and with the knowledge that more rebellions are coming. The Great Spring Sickness has killed the king and 2 heirs, creating a succession crisis. And the new king is a weak, bookish figure who leaves actual governance to his deeply unpopular bastard half-brother. But it gets worse. The second Blackfyre Rebellion breaks out in 211 AC, just 2 years after the first. This one is put down relatively quickly, but it shows that the threat is ongoing and that Targaryen enemies are willing to keep trying. Then in 212 AC, during the events of the Mystery Night, we see another attempted Blackfyre Rising, this one centered around a wedding tourney at White Walls. Dunk and Egg are right in the middle of it, and they help Bloodraven foil the plot. But the fact that these rebellions keep happening shows just how precarious Targaryen power really is. Throughout the 220s and into the 230s AC, the realm continues to be plagued by Blackfyre sympathizers and outright rebellions. The third Blackfyre Rebellion happens in 219 AC. Each of these rebellions weakens the Targaryens further, not just militarily, but politically. Every great house has to choose sides, families are divided, and the realm never really has time to heal and recover. It's like trying to run a marathon while someone keeps stabbing you in the leg. You might still be moving forward, but you're bleeding out the whole time. Now let's talk about the succession itself during this period, because it's an absolute mess. After Aerys dies in 221 AC, the throne passes to his younger brother Maekar. This is Egg's father, the same Maekar who accidentally killed Baelor Breakspear during the trial by combat. Maekar is actually a capable warrior and leader, but he's carrying massive guilt about his brother's death, and he's got his own family drama to deal with. Maekar's sons are a disaster. His eldest, Darren, is a drunk with no interest in knighthood or governance. His second son, Aegon, is a sadistic psychopath who drinks wildfire thinking it will turn him into a dragon, an experiment that unsurprisingly kills him. His third son, Aemon, is brilliant and capable but chooses to become a Maester rather than pursue the throne. That leaves Aegon, our egg, the fourth son of a fourth son, which is why he's called Aegon the Unlikely. Nobody ever expected him to be king. When Maekar dies in 233 AC, fighting an outlaw lord, the succession is so messed up that they have to call a great council to decide who should be king. Think about that. The Targaryens, who once had such clear succession that they could plan generations ahead, now need to basically hold an election to figure out who should wear the crown. This is not a sign of a strong dynasty. The Great Council ultimately chooses Aegon, our egg, partly because his older brother Aemon refuses the throne, and partly because nobody can agree on any of the other candidates. Aegon becomes Aegon V in 233 AC, and he rules until his death in 259 AC at the tragedy of Summerhall. During his reign, Aegon tries his best to improve conditions for the common people and strengthen the realm, but he faces enormous resistance from the great houses. This is the key thing to understand about the Targaryen weakness during this era. Without dragons, they can't simply enforce their will on the great houses. Every reform Aegon tries to implement, every attempt to improve the lives of the small folk is met with resistance from the nobility. The great houses have gotten used to doing whatever they want without fear of dragonfire, and they're not about to let some well-meaning king change that. The Blackfyre Rebellions continue throughout Aegon's reign. The Fourth Rebellion breaks out in 236 AC, just 3 years into his rule. Aegon has to personally lead his forces against the Blackfyres, taking his sons with him to the battle at Wendwater Bridge. His old friend and protector, Sir Duncan the Tall, who is now Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, kills the Blackfyre Pretender in single combat. But the fact that these rebellions keep happening, that there are always Blackfyre sympathizers willing to rise up, shows that Targaryen legitimacy is constantly being questioned. The fifth and final Blackfyre Rebellion doesn't happen until 260 AC after Aegon's death, but the threat hangs over his entire reign like a sword of Damocles. Every Targaryen king during this period has to worry about plots, about great houses switching sides, about bastard pretenders sailing from Essos with sellsword companies. This is a far cry from the days when a Targaryen king could simply point at a rebellious lord and say burn him, and a dragon would make the problem go away. Let's also consider the broader political situation. The Dornish integration into the Seven Kingdoms, which happened under Daeron the Seal through marriage rather than conquest, created a lot of resentment among the other kingdoms. Many nobles saw this as weakness, as selling out to the Dornish after generations of war. This resentment fueled support for the Blackfyres and created lasting divisions in the realm. The Iron Islands continued to raid and pillage the western coast with impunity during this period. Without dragons to threaten them with, the Targaryens can't really stop the Ironborn from doing whatever they want. The North remains distant and semi-independent, doing its own thing beyond the neck. The Vale is insular and focused on its own affairs. The realm is barely held together, and everyone knows it. Now, some people might argue that the Targaryens recovered from this weak period, that Aegon V's grandson Jaehaerys Tseco and great-grandson Aerys Teku Targaryen show that the dynasty bounced back. But I'd argue that this period of weakness created lasting damage that the Targaryens never truly recovered from. The tradition of absolute Targaryen authority was broken. The great houses learned that they could resist the crown, that they could support pretenders, and that without dragons, the Targaryens were just another great house, maybe first among equals, but not the godlike conquerors of old. This weakness is directly connected to Robert's rebellion that happens decades later. When Aerys II descends into madness and starts burning lords alive, the great houses are willing to rise up against him in a way that they never would have when dragons existed. They've learned over the course of the Blackfyre Rebellions and the weak kings of the Dunk and Egg era that Targaryens can be beaten, that they can be overthrown, that fire and blood aren't enough without actual fire-breathing dragons to back it up. The tragedy of the Dunk and Egg era is that you've got genuinely good people trying to hold things together. Duncan the Tall is the epitome of the true knight, humble, brave, and loyal. Aegon Vive, despite being born to privilege, learns humility and compassion through his adventures with Dunk. These are characters we root for, and they're trying their best in an impossible situation. But structural weaknesses in the dynasty, the loss of the dragons, the Blackfyre threat, the devastating plagues, the weak succession, these are problems that even the best people can't completely fix. It's also worth noting that Aegon V becomes obsessed with hatching dragon eggs later in his reign. He encountered so much resistance to his reforms, so much pushback from the great houses, that he came to believe the only way to truly rule effectively was to bring back the dragons. This desperation leads directly to the tragedy at Summerhall, where Aegon, Duncan the Tall, and Aegon's heir, Duncan the Small, all die in a catastrophic fire, possibly an attempt to hatch dragon eggs that went horribly wrong. The Dunk and Egg era shows us what happens when a dynasty that built its power on an overwhelming advantage, in this case dragons, loses that advantage and has to figure out how to govern through more conventional means. The Targaryens struggle because they've never really had to build the kinds of political alliances and institutional structures that other royal families rely on. They've always had the dragons as a fallback, and without them, all their weaknesses are exposed. The period also shows the cost of civil war and how it can weaken even the strongest dynasties. Each Blackfyre Rebellion bleeds the realm, divides families, and forces people to choose sides. The cumulative effect of 5 separate rebellions over the course of 6 decades is absolutely devastating. By the time we get to Aegon V's reign, there's barely any Targaryen prestige left. They're holding on through sheer determination and the loyalty of people like Duncan the Tall, but the writing is on the wall. In many ways, the Dunk and Egg era is the most human period of Targaryen rule. These aren't dragon riders dispensing fire and blood from above. These are regular people dealing with mundane problems like bandits, disputed water rights, and political conspiracies. It's compelling precisely because the stakes feel more personal, more immediate, but it's also sad because we know that despite their best efforts, despite Duncan's loyalty and Aegon's good intentions, they're fighting a losing battle against the decline of their dynasty. The Great Spring Sickness alone probably killed more Targaryens than any rebellion or battle in their history. When you lose your king and 2 heirs to a plague, that's not just a tragedy, that's an institutional failure. It shows that the Targaryens are vulnerable in ways that their dragon-riding ancestors never were. Aegon, the Conqueror, never had to worry about disease. He just climbed on Balerion's back and solved his problems with fire. But Daeron II, Valar, and Mataris, they died like any other men, helpless before a microscopic enemy. The reliance on Bloodraven during this period is also telling. Yes, he's effective at maintaining order, but he does it through fear, surveillance, and brutal crackdowns on anyone suspected of Blackfyre sympathies. This is not how you run a stable, prosperous kingdom. This is how you run a paranoid police state. The fact that the Targaryens need someone like Bloodraven to keep the realm together shows just how precarious their position really is. Looking at the broader arc of Targaryen history, the Dunk and Egg era represents the transition point between the old Targaryen power based on dragons and conquest, and the new Targaryen power based on tradition and dynastic legitimacy. But that transition is messy and incomplete. They never quite figure out how to rule effectively without dragons, which is why Aegon V becomes so desperate to bring them back. And his desperation leads to the tragedy at Summerhall, which kills some of the best people in the entire dynasty. What makes this era fascinating from a storytelling perspective is that George R.R. Martin is showing us the slow decline of a dynasty in real time. We're watching good people struggle against historical forces beyond their control. We're seeing how the decisions of previous generations, Aegon IV's legitimization of his bastards, the dance of the dragons, the loss of the dragons, create problems that can't be easily solved. It's a masterclass in how history isn't just about great men and dramatic events, but about long-term trends and structural weaknesses. The Dunk and Egg stories also give us perspective on the main Game of Thrones narrative. When we see Daenerys hatching her dragon eggs and beginning to reconquer Westeros, we understand just how much the Targaryens lost when their dragons died. We see why Aegon was so desperate to bring them back, why he was willing to risk everything at Summerhall. Dragons aren't just cool fantasy creatures, they're the ultimate force multiplier, the thing that makes a Targaryen more than just another noble with delusions of grandeur. In conclusion, the Targaryen dynasty during the Dunk and Egg era was at its weakest point for several interconnected reasons. The extinction of the dragons removed their ultimate weapon and source of legitimacy. The Blackfyre Rebellions created ongoing civil wars that bled the realm and divided families. The Great Spring Sickness killed a king and his heirs, creating succession chaos. Weak or unsuitable kings like Aerys I and the troubled princes of Maekar's generation meant that the dynasty lacked strong leadership precisely when it needed it most. And the reliance on figures like Bloodraven to maintain order through fear and brutality showed that Targaryen power was built on sand rather than stone. Despite all of this, or maybe because of it, the Dunk and Egg stories remain some of George R.R. Martin's most beloved work. There's something deeply human about watching these characters struggle against impossible odds, trying to be good people in a system that doesn't reward goodness. Duncan and Egg represent the best of what the Targaryens could be: loyalty, courage, and compassion, but they're operating in a context that makes those virtues insufficient to solve the dynasty's fundamental problems. The legacy of this weak period echoes through the rest of Targaryen history. The dynasty never truly recovers its former strength, and the problems that plague the Dunk and Egg era, questions of legitimacy, succession crises, the loss of military advantage, all resurfaced during Robert's Rebellion. In many ways, Robert's Rebellion is just the final chapter in a story that began with the death of the last dragon and the legitimization of the great bastards. The Targaryens had 100 years to figure out how to rule without dragons, and they never quite managed it. Thanks so much for watching today's deep dive into this fascinating period of Westerosi history. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your fellow Game of Thrones fans. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Dunk and Egg era. Do you think the Targaryens could have recovered if Aegon V had succeeded in hatching dragons at Summerhall? What do you think would have happened if Baelor Breakspear had lived? I love hearing your theories and thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Next time, we're going to be exploring the tragedy at Summerhall in detail, so you won't want to miss that. Until then, keep reading, keep watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Valar Morghulis.